was wrong, not by a little. Not a rounding error, not a misplaced decimal. The number on the estate attorney's document was $340,000 less than what my grandmother's account statement showed 3 months ago, and I had memorized that statement the way most people memorize their childhood phone number, automatically, permanently, without trying. I'm a forensic accountant. I work for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio, and my entire job is finding the money people think they'd hidden. I've caught embezzlement in family-owned restaurants. I've unwound fraudulent insurance claims. I once traced $2.3 million through 17 shell companies back to a city councilman's personal checking account. I know what a discrepancy looks like, and I know what a discrepancy looks like, and I know what it feels like when the discrepancy is sitting across the table from you, wearing your uncle's face. My grandmother passed in February, 6 weeks after her 81st birthday. Her name was Dorothy, and she was the kind of woman who kept a budget ledger by hand until the day she died, who knew the price of eggs at every grocery store within 5 miles of her house, who built a small but real estate portfolio from nothing after my grandfather died in 1987 and left her with 2 kids, a mortgage, and about $400 in a savings account. She left behind a house in Westerville, a rental duplex on the east side, and a brokerage account. She also left behind a will that named me and my younger brother Marcus as equal beneficiaries. Our uncle, my mother's brother, a man I'll call by his actual role here because that's all he ever really was to me, had been managing her finances for the last 3 years. He'd convinced her to give him power of attorney when her arthritis got bad and she had trouble driving. He took over her bills, her accounts, her mail. My mother knew. She didn't say anything because he's her little brother and she has never once in her life told him no. The estate attorney's office smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. My uncle sat at one end of the conference table looking relaxed in the way people look relaxed when they think they've already won. My mother sat next to him, hands folded, not making eye contact with me. Marcus was on my left, 26 years old, and already fidgeting with his phone, because Marcus trusts that things will work out, and I have spent my entire adult life knowing that they don't, not on their own. The attorney walked us through the summary. The house, the duplex, the brokerage account, current value, $214,000. I didn't react. I've learned not to. In my line of work, the moment you show someone you found something, they start moving things around, but I wrote the number down, $214,000. 3 months ago, when my grandmother had a scare and ended up in the hospital for 4 days with a respiratory infection, she'd asked me to bring her some paperwork from her desk drawer at home. I'd seen the brokerage statement. I hadn't been snooping. It was sitting right on top, and I'm a forensic accountant. My brain reads financial documents the way other people's brains read text messages. Current account value, $557,400. 6 weeks later, she was gone. 6 weeks after that, the account held $214,000. I said nothing in that meeting. I asked 2 questions, both about timeline, about when the estate would close, and I took my copy of the documents home and I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Then I started working. I want to be clear about something. There's a version of this story where I called my mother that night, where I said, I think something is wrong. I think he took money, where I gave everyone the benefit of the doubt and the chance to explain themselves before I did anything else. I didn't do that, not because I'm cold, because I've seen what happens when you tip people off before you have everything. They move things, they call lawyers, they get their story straight, and then you have suspicions, and they have documentation, and suspicions lose. So I didn't say anything. I just started building my file. The first thing I did was request a full transaction history from the brokerage. I had standing to do it. I was a named beneficiary and the estate was in probate. It took 11 days to get the records, and those 11 days were some of the longest of my life. I went to Sunday dinners. I listened to my uncle talk about how much work it had been to manage everything, how hard the last few years had been on him, how grateful my grandmother would have been. I watched my mother nod. I ate pot roast and said things like, I can only imagine, and you really did so much for her. I got very good at keeping my face still. When the records came in, I sat in my car in the parking garage at work and read them on my laptop. 14 withdrawals over 22 months. The smallest was $8,000. The largest was $61,000. They came in irregular intervals, not every month, sometimes 2 in 1 month, then nothing for 6 weeks. The pattern of someone who understood that regular, consistent withdrawals are easier to spot. He moved the money to an account I didn't recognize. I ran the routing number. It was a credit union in Dublin, Ohio, a personal account, not a business account. $343,000. Gone. Here's the thing about stealing from a forensic accountant. You don't know that's what you're doing. To my uncle, I was just his sister's daughter. I worked at some accountant firm downtown. I'd been quiet at the table. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't asked hard questions. He looked at me and saw someone he could manage. That is the only advantage I have ever needed. I spent 3 weeks building the case before I called anyone. I documented every withdrawal, every transfer, the dates, the amounts, the account they went to. I pulled public records on my uncle and found a pattern I recognized immediately. A man living beyond what his income could explain. A boat bought in 2022, a renovation permit on his house in 2023, a lease on a pickup truck that cost more per month than my car payment. The money had a story. I just had to tell it correctly. I called an estate litigation attorney named Patricia, who a colleague had used 2 years ago in a similar case. I laid everything out in a 1-hour meeting, brought my documentation, and watched her expression shift from polite professional attention to something sharper. She said, "You're sure about these numbers?" I said, "I'm a forensic accountant. The numbers are what I'm always sure about." She said she'd take the case. The confrontation, because there had to be one, I knew that needed to happen on my terms. Not in a phone call he could hang up on. Not in an email he could ignore. Not at a family dinner where my mother would spend the whole time trying to smooth things over and protect him from consequences he had earned. I called my uncle and told him I had some questions about the estate that I needed to go over in person, that there were some documents I needed him to sign so we could close probate. I kept my voice light, routine, administrative. He agreed without hesitating. Why wouldn't he? He thought I was handling paperwork. We met at his house on a Saturday morning in April. My mother was there, which I had expected. He'd invited her because he wanted a buffer, someone to soften things if I got difficult. What he didn't know was that Patricia was in my car in the driveway, that I had a recording device in my jacket pocket, legal in Ohio, one-party consent, and that I had not slept more than 5 hours in any of the last 4 nights because I had been too busy preparing for this. I sat down at his kitchen table. He offered me coffee. I said no thank you. I put the documents on the table. Not the estate documents. My documents. The transaction history, the account records, the routing number trace, the public record showing his purchases, everything organized in a binder with tabs. I slid it across to him and I said, "I need you to look at page 1. He looked. I watched the muscles in his face rearrange themselves. The easy smile tightened. He glanced at my mother. She said, "What is this?" I said, "It's $343,000 that left Grandma Dorothy's brokerage account over 22 months and went into a personal account at Dublin Credit Union. A personal account registered to him." My mother looked at her brother. He was still looking at the page. He tried 3 things in the next 4 minutes. First, he tried confusion. He didn't know what I was talking about. There must be some mistake. Accounts are complicated. I showed him the routing number documentation. Then he tried justification. There were expenses. Caregiving costs money. My grandmother had authorized these transfers. I asked him to show me the authorization. He didn't have it because it didn't exist. Then he tried anger. He stood up and told me I had no right to come into his home and accuse him of anything, that this family had always had jealous people who wanted to tear it apart, that he would call his attorney. I said, "Please do. My attorney is in the driveway. She has copies of everything in that binder." That's when the room got quiet in a way I had not quite expected, even though I had prepared for it. Silence has a texture when something has finally run out of road. My mother said, "You brought an attorney?" I said, "He stole from Grandma Dorothy." "He stole from me and from Marcus. What did you think I was going to do?" What I want to say about my mother is that I don't think she knew the full amount. I think she knew something wasn't quite right and chose not to look at it closely, which is its own kind of choice. But I don't think she knew about the boat and the renovation and $340,000 systematically moved out of her own mother's account. The look on her face when he couldn't produce an authorization, that was not the look of someone whose cover story had collapsed. That was the look of someone realizing the thing they hadn't let themselves think about was true after all. She didn't defend him again after that. Patricia came in from the driveway. The conversation that followed was not loud. That surprised people when I told them about it later. They expected screaming, a blow-up, something dramatic. But when the documentation is complete and the other person knows it, there's no energy for screaming. There's only the specific kind of stillness that comes before surrender. My uncle was going to repay the estate in full, plus interest calculated at the statutory rate from the date of each withdrawal. He was going to sign a confession of judgment, which meant that if he failed to pay on any schedule we agreed to, we could immediately begin collection proceedings without returning to court. He was going to resign any remaining role in the estate administration. In exchange, we would not file a criminal complaint. That last part was not my preference. I want to say that clearly. Patricia walked me through the practical math. A criminal case would take years, would cost money, would depend on a prosecutor's office that was already backlogged, and would not guarantee that Marcus and I recovered $1. The civil route, with a confession of judgment, was faster and more certain. I thought about my grandmother's handwritten ledger. I thought about her knowing the price of eggs at every store within 5 miles. I signed what I needed to sign, and I kept the rest of my thoughts to myself. He paid. Not all at once. It took 18 months, a structured repayment schedule that Patricia built with teeth in it. Every payment came in on time because he knew what the alternative was. Marcus got his share. I got mine. My relationship with my mother has never gone back to what it was before, and I don't say that with as much sadness as I used to. We see each other at holidays. We talk on the phone sometimes. She has never once said you were right to do what you did, and I have learned, slowly, imperfectly, that I do not need her to. What she did say, about 8 months after everything was resolved, in a parking lot after Christmas dinner, was, "She worked so hard for that money." She was talking about my grandmother. She was crying a little. I said, "I know. That's why I did what I did." She nodded, and we stood there for a minute, and then she got in her car and drove home. The thing about being a forensic accountant is that you spend your whole career looking for the things someone hoped you wouldn't find. You get very comfortable with the idea that discrepancies exist, that numbers lie when people want them to, that the gap between what a document says and what actually happened is often the most important place in the room. My grandmother built something from almost nothing. She kept her ledger by hand. She knew the price of eggs. I learned from her without knowing I was learning that you pay attention, that you keep records, that you don't let the number on the page be the last word when the number doesn't add up. The estate closed in September of the following year. Marcus used his share to pay off his student loans and put the rest into a retirement account. I invested mine. I kept one thing from my grandmother's house that I hadn't asked for specifically, but that my mother quietly set aside for me when we were clearing out her belongings, her budget ledger. 1989 through 2021, 32 years of careful handwritten records. Every column in balance, every number. True, I keep it on my desk at work. When I find a discrepancy, and I always find it, that's the job. I look at that ledger, and I think about a woman who built something real. And I do not stop looking until the numbers tell me the truth. They always do, eventually. Numbers always do. People ask me sometimes if I feel bad about how it ended, about the fact that my uncle had to liquidate the boat, sell the truck, restructure his whole life to pay back money he never should have touched in the first place. And I understand why they ask. It's a family after all. These things are supposed to feel complicated. They don't for me. Not anymore. What I've come to understand is that consequences are not cruelty. My uncle made choices one at a time over 22 months, knowing exactly what he was doing. He didn't stumble into $343,000. He planned it. He structured it. He chose amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic flags. He spent the money on things he wanted. At every single step, he had the option to stop, and he didn't take it. That's not a mistake. That's a decision, and decisions have weight that eventually has to be carried by someone. For a long time, the weight was being carried by my grandmother. She built that account dollar by dollar across decades, kept her ledger by hand, denied herself things so that the number would grow. She trusted the wrong person because he was family and she was 81 and her hands hurt. The betrayal of her specific, particular trust, is something I will never find a clean way to think about. But here is what I know. I could not undo what happened to her. I could only make sure it didn't go unanswered. There's a version of me that stays quiet. That tells herself it's too complicated, too painful, that families are messy and maybe she's misreading the numbers. That confrontation will make everything worse. I know that version of myself well. I spent 11 days being her while I waited for those transaction records to arrive, going to Sunday dinners and eating pot roast and keeping my face completely still. Those 11 days were not easy. Restraint when you already know the answer takes a kind of discipline that doesn't get enough credit. But discipline is the whole thing, isn't it? Not the dramatic moment in the kitchen when I slid the binder across the table. That part took about 40 minutes. The real work was the 3 weeks before it. The late nights. The document requests. The decision to build the case completely before I opened my mouth, because I knew that incomplete evidence just gives people room to maneuver. Marcus got to pay off his student loans. He called me after the first payment cleared and he cried a little, and I let him because he'd earned that. Our grandmother would have been so pleased about those loans being gone. She hated debt the way she hated wasted food. On principle, viscerally, from experience, I keep her ledger on my desk. 32 years of handwritten columns. I look at it when I'm tired, when a case is taking longer than it should, when I'm tempted to cut a corner or accept a number that doesn't quite add up. She never cut corners. She never accepted a number that didn't make sense. She just kept going back to the page until everything balanced. That's the whole lesson as far as I can tell. Not some grand philosophy. Just pay attention, keep records, don't stop looking until the numbers tell you the truth. And when someone tries to tell you that what you clearly see isn't there, that the gap doesn't exist, that you must be wrong, that you should let it go, trust yourself anyway. The numbers don't lie. And neither should you.